10,000 years ago, the landscape of North Africa was green. The people living there were nomadic hunter-gatherers, tracking wildlife across a fertile savanna. But around 7000 BCE, the rains stopped, the lakes dried up, and the expanding Sahara forced these early humans to seek a reliable water source. They gathered along the banks of the Nile. Unlike other major river systems, the Nile operated on a remarkably reliable schedule. Every summer, it flooded, depositing a thick layer of mineral-rich silt that made the soil wildly productive. This exact, predictable cycle gave early Egyptians a powerful idea: Ma'at, a belief that the universe operates on a natural, balanced, and eternal cosmic order. Narmer recorded his victory on ceremonial stone slabs, where he appears striking down a kneeling captive. This imagery established the king as the primary protector of the cosmic order, framing his conquest as a divine requirement. Year after year, the river rose and fell exactly on schedule. This perfect rhythm convinced the early Egyptians that their newly unified state was permanent and that their world would never really change. During the period we call the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh was a literal god whose primary job was to keep the cosmic harmony intact. Maintaining that balance meant pouring millions of tons of limestone and massive amounts of human labor into constructing colossal monuments like the pyramids of Giza. But around 2200 BCE, the climate across North Africa shifted again. The historically reliable summer floods suddenly stopped coming. Without the annual delivery of fresh silt, the agricultural system stalled. Crop yields dropped, food shortages quickly turned into widespread famine, and the central state found itself with practically nothing to tax. The entire justification for the pharaoh's power was his control over the natural order. Because the land was dying, citizens realized the king had no actual power over the cosmos. Recognizing the weakness in the capital, local provincial governors started keeping their local resources and ruling their territories independently. A society built on the assumption of absolute predictability cannot pivot when the environment turns hostile. Stripped of its agricultural wealth, the central government splintered, and Egypt collapsed into a dark age of regional rivalries. It took nearly a century of fragmentation before a ruler from the south named Mentuhotep II managed to defeat his rivals and reunite the state. This kicked off the Middle Kingdom, but the definition of the pharaoh changed. Sculptures from this era show leaders with deeply lined faces and somber expressions, reflecting a new identity as a shepherd responsible for the welfare of the people. This topographic map shows the Fayum Depression, a natural marshland adjacent to the Nile. They engineered a massive insurance policy against future droughts by diverting water from the main river into an artificial reservoir. During dry seasons, they could release this stored water into surrounding agricultural grids, guaranteeing that crops would grow even if the Nile floods failed again. The economy boomed, but wealth attracts attention. The northern Delta region, historically the most open border in Egypt, drew in thousands of migrants from the Levant. The Egyptians called them the Hyksos. The migrants initially arrived as traders and craftsmen looking for opportunity, but growing rich while leaving your borders completely porous is an invitation for someone else to step in and take over. As the Egyptian central authority naturally weakened again around 1650 BCE, Hyksos leaders seized the delta. They managed to conquer the north because they brought military technology the Egyptians hadn't faced before: fast, mobile horse-drawn chariots and highly lethal bronze weapons. To survive, the native rulers trapped in the south had to adapt. A king named Ahmose I studied the enemy's tactics and reverse-engineered their designs, equipping his own army with chariots and bronze blades to systematically push the Hyksos out of Egypt. This brutal occupation taught the newly formed New Kingdom a harsh lesson. Waiting comfortably behind your borders to be attacked was a death sentence. To stay safe, Egypt transformed into an aggressive empire, pushing outward into Syria to build massive territorial buffer zones. Sacking foreign cities brought in mountains of gold, silver, and exotic goods. They funneled this wealth into aggressive architecture, peaking under Ramesses II. He carved these colossal 20-meter-tall statues of himself directly into the cliffs at Abu Simbel as a permanent projection of imperial power. Yet empires rot from the inside. A pharaoh named Akhenaten tried to force the entire country to worship a single sun god, closing traditional temples and upending society. You can see the strangeness of his reign in the art, like this famous bust of his wife Nefertiti, featuring stylized, elongated proportions. While he obsessed over his religious revolution, he ignored desperate requests for military help from his allies, allowing Egyptian diplomatic control to completely crumble. The world had become faster, more connected, and vastly more violent. The isolated farming communities of the early Nile had been replaced by a militarized superpower. Maintaining an empire eventually drains the treasury. When a mysterious coalition of raiders known as the Sea Peoples swept through the Mediterranean, Egypt fought them off on land and water, but the cost was staggering. The economy collapsed. Royal tomb workers went on strike for unpaid grain, and the central authority shattered for the final time. Stripped of its defenses, the Nile Valley turned into a battleground. Over the next several centuries, it was occupied by Nubian kings from the south, sacked by brutal Assyrian armies from the east, and eventually swallowed by the massive Persian Empire. By the time Alexander the Great arrived in 332 BCE, the Egyptians were so exhausted by heavy Persian taxation that they welcomed the Macedonian as a liberator. His generals would go on to establish the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, ruling Egypt for the next 300 years. The successive empires that claimed the Nile merely attempted to erase its local identity. Nubian kings commissioned pyramids to honor Egyptian gods, Persian emperors adopted the titles of pharaohs, and Greek rulers funded traditional temples, inscribing their names in hieroglyphs. The political state was broken, but the cultural gravity of the region was so dense, it simply swallowed whoever sat on the throne. Cleopatra was the culmination of this cultural fusion, a highly educated ruler of Greek descent who fully adopted the image of a traditional Egyptian god queen, blending her Hellenistic heritage with ancient royal authority. She tried to protect her kingdom by navigating the civil wars of the Roman Republic, forming a military alliance with Mark Antony, but they were outmaneuvered by his rival, Octavian, and their naval forces were crushed at the Battle of Actium. Facing capture, Cleopatra took her own life in 30 BCE. The triumphant Octavian, who would soon become the Emperor Augustus, stripped Egypt of its independence and absorbed it entirely as a province of the Roman Empire. Ancient Egypt's sovereignty lasted 3 millennia because the civilization learned to rebuild its identity to outlast every environmental and political collapse. That capacity for constant reinvention remains their most durable monument.